कंठकुटुम्बिनि भूरि कुटुम्बिनि भूरि कृते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते सुरवरवर्षिणि दुर्धरदर्शिनि दुर्मुखमर्षिणि हर्षरते त्रिभुवनपोषिणि शङ्करतोषिणि किल्बिषमोषिणि घोषरते धनुजनि रोषिणि दितिश्रुतरोषिणि दुर्मथतोषिणि सिन्धुसुते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते जय जय हे महिषासुरमर्दिनि रम्यकपर्दिनि शैलसुते
Hi guys, thank you for joining the live stream. Today we have another fun paper to discuss with us, also sent by Mr. Sociologist. And this is another of those papers by Irfan Habib, which is going to, I think, create a lot of respect for him in your hearts as a great scholar. For some reason, except when he talks about Ram Mandir Hindutva issues, he writes great stuff and does great research, or why temple destruction happened and whether someone should reclaim those temples or not. He says things some of us disagree with obviously, but other than that, I just read the conclusion half of the paper just to get a vibe of it and make the thumbnail relevant. And there, as you all can see, the title of the very video, today's live stream, is the spoiler that why didn't the capitalism ever happen in India. That's the weirdest part. So let's start this as soon as possible. So this paper is from 1969, when he was probably at the peak of his cognitive faculties. Although in 1997 he writes that phenomenal paper on caste, which is my all-time favorite paper discussing the caste, the phenomenon of caste in India. This is from 1969, or I'm told, I'm not sure exactly which year this is, because at least this seems pretty old. Potentialities of capitalistic development in the economy of Mughal India. When we ask ourselves the question why India failed to industrialize and develop a capitalistic economy, either before or after the British conquest, we touch the core of an old and hallowed controversy in which the partisans and opponents of British imperialism once confronted each other. To admirers of British rule generally, it seemed that the fault lay with certain inherent weaknesses in society, the influence of an quote-unquote enervating climate, the heritage of Oriental despotism, and recurring cycles of anarchy inhibiting the accumulation and investment of capital, primitive techniques and ignorance, the rigidities of the caste system, the prevailing spirit of resignation rather than enterprise, all created conditions in which nothing but a subsistence economy could function. And in the conclusion section, at least, he explicitly says that the caste system, it's not a system really, it was not to be blamed for India never getting capitalism. And although he's a Marxist and he would have hated capitalism, the tone of his arguments here is in the sense of capitalism, it is bad, but it would have probably been better than the things that were there during the Mughal era, at least, because that was pure exploitation, only accumulation of wealth and no prosperity. From such wretched beginnings, the British could not, or whatever they did, lift Indian economy to European levels. The critics of imperialism saw things in a different light. They insisted that the primitive nature of Indian economy before British conquests ought not to be overstressed, and they ascribed India's backwardness chiefly to the strangulating effects of British rule, to the quote unquote drain of wealth, the destruction of handicrafts, heavy taxation, and discrimination against Indian industry and capital. It will thus be seen that though the controversy involved a number of important aspects of modern Indian economic history, in part at least, it centered on the potentialities of development in the Indian economy prior to the British conquests. For a long time, there was little information at hand on this particular subject. A great advance was accomplished when, under the impetus of the wider controversy, scholars like W.H. Moreland and Brijnarayan attempted to study and analyze the economy of Mughal India on the basis mainly of contemporary evidence. A number of simple generalizations that had till then held sway were now relegated largely to the pages of propagandists, though they still reappear from time to time in the writings of the learned. Since then, again, there have been considerable additions to our knowledge. Unfortunately, large gaps in our information still remain, and on many crucial aspects, our data are pitifully few. But while we must bear the limitations of our evidence in mind, it is yet possible to generalize. And though many of such generalizations may still be in the nature of tentative conclusions or even speculations, these may at least possess the merit of indicating the problems that historians of Mughal Indian economy are seeking to resolve. In the present paper, we are, formally speaking, concerned not with the potentialities of growth, but specifically with potentialities for capitalistic development. It is a reasonable assumption, however, that for all societies other than those of our own today, the only possible road to modern industry lay through capitalism. And it may therefore be taken for granted that the proximity to or distance from true capitalistic relations that a given pre-modern or modern society maintained or that wait and it may therefore be taken for granted that the proximity to or distance from true capitalistic relations that a given pre-modern or modern society maintained offers a valid criterion for judging its capacities of growth, so that in essence the two questions may be treated as identical. That proximity to or distance from true capitalistic relations, pre-modern or modern society maintained offers okay, whether the pre-modern society was had a proximity to capitalistic relations or it didn't have a proximity to capitalistic relations, both questions are treated as identical. A rather more difficult question is one of definition. What do capitalistic relations consist of? For the sake of consistency and clarity, the Marxist definitions of the terms capital and capitalism, and also of certain other terms, have been followed in this paper. Capitalistic relations are therefore considered by us as not mere money or market relations, but relations based on a particular mode of production in which the producer is separated from his tools, so that while he himself is a wage laborer, the implements of production, together with raw materials and the finished product, are owned by his employer, the capitalist. This definition, in effect, restricts capitalism properly to the economic organization that became dominant with the coming of the Industrial Revolution. This may be objected to by those who regard the essence of capitalism as consisting the prevalence of market economy, and so would date the rise of capitalism in Europe at a period much before the 18th and 19th century, which we could call proto-capitalism. However, without anticipating our own arguments about Mughal Indian economy, it may be suggested as a possibility that a society may have a well-developed money economy without evolving machine industry, and it would therefore be better to have a definition of capitalism which is narrow, if not also more precise. At the same time, the importance of market economy as a precondition, though not necessarily the fountainhead of capitalistic development, has to be given due recognition, and therefore we shall be concerning ourselves also with the scale and nature of money relations and commodity production in the various sectors of the economy of Mughal India. Now the chapter starts. This was the introduction of the paper. Yeah, he probably would, but we don't care. एक बार लिख दिया तो लिख दिया. And especially if he disowns now, then we don't care even more, because he's about 200 years old now. Why would I trust his cognitive abilities, faculties now than when how it was when he was writing these papers? Capitalism means the sway of capital, and the latter implies accumulation. The sway of capital implies accumulation, which again must directly or ultimately arise out of production, or rather out of the surplus product, the total net product minus the cost of subsistence of the producer. So uh, that which creates profit. It may be argued that the emergence of capitalism becomes possible only when the surplus products attain a certain minimum magnitude, enabling primary accumulation to take place. If per capita product is very low, the surplus might not reach that minimum, and accumulation might not occur, and therefore profit won't happen, and therefore a business won't get scale, and therefore won't be able to hire more people, since it has actually been said that and therefore no job security, not official job security definitely, but even no real job security for the person working in that company, because it can shut down at any moment because there was not enough accumulation. Since it has actually been said that Indian economy was precisely in such a situation before the British conquest, we may be justified in giving some space to this matter. For all practical purposes, in the case of Mughal India, this is a question of the level of agricultural production. Though we should like to know a great deal more about Indian agriculture during the 17th century, some essential facts are fairly well established. First of all, there was a great abundance of land. A study of the official Mughal area statistics and other geographical information indicates that the extent of cultivation then was about half of what it was about the beginning of this century in the middle Gangetic basin and central India, and from 2/3 to 1/5 in other regions. Extent of cultivation then was about half of what it was about the beginning of the century. From this, it may be reasonably inferred that compared to the conditions around the year 1900, cultivation was confined to the more fertile lands in 1600. That owing to larger wastes and pastures, uh, more cattle could be kept, indicating not only a larger output of pastoral products per capita, but also a greater use of cattle power in agriculture. That each household farm should have approximated more closely to the optimum size, and finally, that a greater amount of double cropping could have been undertaken by the peasants. At the same time, the agricultural technology in 1600 differed in no significant respect from what it was in 1900. A new important factor in 1900 undoubtedly was the large-scale canal irrigation network laid out by the British in the Indus Basin and the Upper Gangetic region. It may also be urged that the railways facilitated the raising of crops for which particular lands or localities were most suited, and there were some new crops, the cultivation of which expanded substantially during the 19th century, namely maize and the plantation crops, tea and coffee. But after weighing all these factors, it would hardly be possible to consider per capita agricultural output as being lower in 1600 than in 1900. Holy shit. It is also very likely that in per capita agricultural productivity, Mughal India was not in any way backward when compared with other contemporary societies, including those of Western Europe. However, it is not simply the level of output that is to be considered in estimating the scale of the surplus. Of direct significance for accumulation is not so much the amount of the output as the size of the surplus. It is therefore important to consider what the cost of subsistence was. Not much argument is needed to demonstrate that the mere cost of survival in a tropical or semi-tropical climate is far less than in a colder one. Within India, the cost of subsistence was not uniform, and in fact would seem to have varied more often in an inverse ratio to the productivity of the soil. It struck a 17th century observer from the north, for example, that southern India had its large and massive temples because while the land was immensely productive, the subsistence needs of the population in comparison, presumably with those of the northern regions, were extremely few, so that the surplus available was very great. There is little doubt then that the absence of capitalistic development in India cannot be attributed very simply to a low level of agricultural production. Given the minimum size of the agricultural surplus, it is really the mode of its appropriation and ultimate distribution which can but may not contain the seeds of capitalism. The agricultural surplus may be appropriated and shared in various ways that are reducible, theoretically speaking, to two basic forms: a demand from outside imposed on the producer, for example, rent, and B, a gain accruing as a result of the appropriator's undertaking or organizing the productive process himself, for example, peasants' savings, profits of the capitalist farmer, etc. MR, this paper is from 1969, and his caste paper is from 1997. Tax called Butfaroshi, not Butfaroshi or Butfaroshti. Yeah, oh, acha, Butfaroshi. Butfaroshti meant Butparasti, I guess, also pronounced as Butparasti. It was called, it meant selling and dealing in idols. And Butshikni meant destroying the idols. So, peasant savings, profits of the capitalist farmer. Since this division is merely theoretical, not historical, there is no chronological sequence involved. Each embraces numerous types of relations found at various stages of economic development. Thus, though capitalistic farming proper belongs to form B, which is a gain accruing as a result of the appropriator's undertaking or organizing the productive process himself, farming carried on through slave labor is also a category of form B. Okay. On the other hand, rent in kind and rent in cash are both covered by Form A, which is a demand from outside imposed on the producer. But the latter type of rent, which is rent in cash, has been regarded as of considerable significance in encouraging commodity production and thereby preparing the ground for the rise of capitalism. Form A, again, a demand from outside imposed on the producer. Form A might also be superimposed on Form B. For example, what if the landlord's rent from the capitalist farmer, okay? The landlord's rent from the capitalist farmer and thus does not itself imply any particular mode of production serving for its purpose, serving for its basis. So, does not itself imply any particular mode of production serving for its basis. In Mughal India, the dominant form of surplus appropriation was what we have styled Form A. So outside pressure, demand from outside imposed on the producer. Its two distinct elements were peasant agriculture as the mode of production and the land revenue representing the bulk of surplus appropriated. Our pursuit of possible capitalistic elements in the agricultural sector must therefore begin with a closer study of the interaction of these two elements. Our information on the point is sufficiently abundant for us to say with confidence that, if except for rare possible exceptions, Indian peasant farming was organized on individualistic lines. Each peasant had his own separate holding. Owing to land abundance, land in most areas had little or no price, but seed and cattle were important forms of peasant property, and individual ownership must necessarily have given rise to stratification within the peasantry, even if other causative factors are ignored. At the same time, the Indian village presented the appearance of a closed, custom-based social and economic unit. Fair enough. The closed settlement of peasant households and the needs for peasant migrants to move in a body for better protection furnished the basis for a collective organization of peasants within the framework of clan and caste, the Indian village community. With this community were associated hereditary artisans and village servants who provided the peasants with goods and services needed by them, obviously. They were paid by the peasants as a body, for the community had a financial pool, and as individuals according to customary rates, usually in kind or through allotments of land. To a certain degree, an Indian village was a stable economic unit, essentially self-sufficient in respect to its own consumption needs. It is therefore difficult to see how an inert village market or capitalistic elements could have arisen from any internal development in the Indian village community in its classic form, despite the individualistic organization of production and the economic stratification that must have existed among the peasantry. Nor would a simple appropriation of the surplus produced by any local potentiate introduce any change. If what was appropriated was in kind, not in cash, and was consumed either directly in the magnate's household or distributed among his servants. This would be true very largely of the appropriations by the zamindars, hereditary possessors of a right to share the peasants' produce. In the only instance we have from Awadh of the customary rate of the Zamindar's claim upon the peasant, the collection in kind 10 shares of the share, meaning in Bengali to we pronounce it as share, dosh mon share, dosh share chaul, etc. Mon is different. So 10 shares of the crop per bigha, that dwarfs completely that in cash, which was 1 copper coin per bigha. Okay. The collection in kind dwarfs completely the collection in cash. So collection in cash was much less. Irfan Habib writes in the footnote that it's not clear to me why the Soviet writers Alev and Pavlov should attach so much importance to the existence outside the village of weavers, and we may add cotton carders and oilmen, and ascribe to this phenomenon a significant role in the breakup of the quote-unquote breakup of the Indian village community. So long as the relations of such artisans with villagers continued to be determined by custom, there would have been little cause for the village community to be subverted. Right. However, the Zamindar's share of the rent, quote unquote rent, was in Mughal India, definitely a subordinate one. It amounted nominally to 10% of the land revenue in northern India and 25% in Gujarat. In other words, it was the land revenue that represented the bulk of the rent, and it is therefore important to study its nature and magnitude and to consider what consequences it was likely to have for the rural economy. Mal, which we render as land revenue, or mal, was not formally speaking rent from the land. Mal, I think, was not formally speaking from the land, but a tax on the crop. It was basically a share of the crop, and the most simple form in which it was collected was through an actual division of the harvest, batai. But in actual practice, more complex and administratively less strenuous forms were followed. The revenue, for example, was imposed in kind, but the demand was fixed by means of surveys of the cropland and the application of an estimated crop rate upon the area so determined so as to give the estimate of the total crop, kankut. The revenue being a given share of the produce, the total revenue demand could now be stated in kind, but might subsequently be commuted into cash at market or arbitrary prices. In the most developed farm, and in some provinces the most prevalent, a standard cash rate was levied per unit of area, varying according to the crop, zabt. Here too, for purposes of drawing up the schedules, the revenue had to be assumed as a fixed portion of the crop. More so since land under this system of assessment could be placed under either of the other systems mentioned, and vice versa. By and large, it seems that the share of the produce taken as revenue ranged from 1/3 to half in most parts of northern India and the Deccan, but was less in certain arid areas and substantially more in certain fertile tracts. The revenue demand was theoretically assessed separately on each individual peasant according to his holding and the crops raised by him. But in fact, the whole village body was usually made into a single assessee and collectively called upon to pay the revenue levied. Finally, despite the fact that it was basically a share of the produce, land revenue was realized more often in cash, not only under zabt, but also under the systems through commutation of the demand into demand in cash. So under the systems through commutation of the demand into demand in cash. Often when fixed on a village, it appears as an amount of money quite arbitrarily determined. Cash nexus appears as an established institution in the Delhi region as early as the beginning of the 14th century. In Mughal India, our evidence indicates quite plainly that collection of revenue in cash was far more prevalent than collection in kind throughout the empire, although there were local exceptions and also periods in certain regions where there might have been a shift from the one mode to the other. Even when the revenue was collected in kind, the authorities often did so not for purposes of consumption directly or for storage, but for sale. These characteristics of land revenue were historically interwoven with the emergence of a ruling class among whose members it was distributed. The revenue was collected from the peasant directly in the name of the king, either by his own officials for the royal treasury or by his assignees for themselves. The areas from which the revenue went to the treasury were known as khalisa. The khalisa consisted of areas scattered throughout the empire, and its total size varied. In 1647, the estimated revenue of the khalisa amounted to about 13.6% of the total. The remaining portion consisted of jagirs, or territories whose revenues were assigned by the king to his mansabdars, officers or nobles, personal pay, and allowances for the maintenance of their military contingents. Such assignment holders were known as jagirdars. But some mansabdars also drew their pay, wholly or in part, in cash from the royal treasury. For all practical purposes, these mansabdars, especially those holding higher ranks, might be considered as forming the ruling class of the Mughal Empire. This class was largely urbanized and contained a considerable foreign element. It was largely without local roots and was prevented from forming such roots by a system of transfer of posts as well as jagirs. On an average, the period for which an area was held in jagir by any assignee was less than 3 years. तो एक 3 year का contractual job जैसा रहता था. Neither the rank in service nor the jagir, except in the case of certain chiefs, was hereditary. It was surely the highly disciplined class, completely subordinate to a centralized royal despotism, that could make possible the realization of the massive claim on the entire rural surplus of the country that the land revenue represented. Owing to the system of transfers, the noble's household and contingents could not naturally be established permanently on a jagir so as directly to live off the land. In general, the larger the jagir, the greater the distance of the headquarters of the jagirdar's establishment from the villages. And this was apart from the fact that, being highly urbanized, the Mughal nobles in any case disdained rural life. It is therefore no wonder that jagirdars preferred to collect revenue in cash or to commute collections in kind immediately into cash. Since the royal treasury too had to pay out salaries to the mansabdars and others in cash, the tendency in the Khalisa too must have been overwhelmingly towards collections in cash. The major aspects of the land revenue system that we have earlier described are thus explained by the power, organization, and composition of the ruling class. If this is also to be seen the source of an historical phenomenon which is tolerably well documented, namely the tendency toward a steadily intensified pressure upon the peasants and other revenue payers. The source of this tendency, as 17th century writers observed so frequently, was the system of transferring jagirs, which meant that individual revenue assignees could have no interest in the long-term maintenance or growth in the revenue-paying capacity of any particular area. The excessive pressure for greater revenue was ultimately self-defeating, since for immediate gain it sacrificed future possibilities. But the Mughal system did not contain any effective mechanism whereby restraints could have been put against such a fatal course, क्योंकि उन लोगों को कोर्स करेक्शन कभी नहीं आता था. The collection of land revenue would have had two important consequences for the rural economy. In the first place, there was an enormous drain of wealth away from the rural sector. Part of the land revenue undoubtedly stuck to the hands of certain rural elements through shortfalls in collection, remissions, and concessions, and commissions to certain local magnates, chaudhris, kanungos, and the village headman, mukaddams, salaries and perquisites of local revenue staff, etc. This was part of the land revenue, undoubtedly what stuck to. Some of the jagirdars sub-assigned their jagirs to their soldiers who lived in the villages. Besides these, there was a whole class of revenue grantees, comprising the intelligentsia and the idlers. The imperial revenue grants, madadi maash, the imperial revenue grants, the madadi maash, alone counted for 4 to 6% of the total estimated revenue. But after making allowances for all these leakages, it must be assumed that the total net amount of produce annually lost by the countryside without any return must have amounted to a very large portion of the total, at least a fourth of it, if not a third or a half. Secondly, the mechanism by which the bulk of the rural surplus was removed created the conditions for the establishment of the rural market. When the land revenue was collected in cash, the revenue payer was compelled to sell his produce in order to get money to pay for it. But when it was collected in cash, then too, as we have noted, the revenue authorities preferred to sell it. In either case, most of the surplus was put on the market, and therefore a very large portion of agricultural production would not be directly for use but would be commodity production, properly speaking. The market mechanism once established must have reacted on the mode of agricultural production. It is not it not it's it not merely introduced it not only merely introduced money relations into a system of quote unquote natural economy, but also engendered a shift to high grade crops and cash crops, for example from coarser grains to wheat, and to cotton, sugarcane, indigo, poppy, tobacco, etc. This twofold impact of the Mughal revenue system must have led to a considerable subversion of the quote unquote pure peasant economy and an alteration in the nature of the methods of exploitation belonging to our form A. The land revenue represented, as we have seen, an enormous drain on the countryside. Moreover, the built in tendency in the Mughal system was toward an increase in pressure upon the revenue payers. If the estimated revenue statistics do not show any real increase in the totals, that is, in terms of the real increase in the terms of prices, this provides no ground for supporting that the degree of exploitation in terms of real share in the produce remained stable. Excesses in the latter were bound to reduce the total produce and so adversely affect actual revenue collection in the long run. Nor would the cash nexus provide any lasting relief to the peasantry in case of an increase in prices, as one would expect to have happened from one's reading of European economic history. Unlike the Lord's rents, the land revenue rate was firmly based on the conception of its being a set proportion of the produce, and was accordingly variable when stated in cash. As a result, though agricultural prices appear to have risen during the 17th century, the revenue demand did not fall in real terms. Now, within the peasantry, the land revenue being in essence regressive tax, progressive tax and regressive tax दोनों तरह का tax होता है. Regressive tax means that everyone has to pay pretty much the same tax, and that becomes regressive because then समझ लो तुम्हारा सैलरी है 100 रुपए और अंबानी का सैलरी है 1 लाख रुपए, मगर तुम दोनों को ही 20% पैसा देना पड़ता है. तो तुम्हारा 20 रुपए चलेगा, तुम अब 80 रुपए घर लेके बैठे हो, और अंबानी का 1 लाख रुपए से 20% चला गया तो उसको कुछ आता जाता नहीं है. So progressive taxation implies therefore different tax slabs. Now, within the peasantry, the land revenue being in essence a regressive tax fell more heavily upon the poorer than upon the richer strata, which I just explained. Therefore, Vivek was suggesting that there should be a flat tax, but after there's a tax break for the middle class and the lower classes. After a certain amount of economy, flat tax, 12% for everyone. When it presented a set proportion of the produce, it is obvious that the peasant who produced less would have a smaller amount left to him than the one who produced more. It is also possible to argue that when each individual peasant was assessed separately, the village community was naturally bypassed, and the individual was alone made to face all the risks as a revenue payer. This too should have led to economic differentiation. In practice, however, as we have noticed, the village was the usual unit of assessment, and we have evidence that the village community had a distinct role to play in the payment of revenue by means of a financial pool into which all the peasants paid, so village cooperative, and out of which the revenue demand, the other fiscal burdens, and the expenses of the village establishment were met. What a well-oiled machine, almost. This footnote says that the wording of this clause needs two qualifications. The Mughal revenue system was not unique. The characteristics it possessed were really implanted during the earlier part of the 14th century in the Delhi Sultanate. Secondly, cause and effect are difficult to distinguish, and some allowance should be made for the argument that the Sultanate Mughal revenue systems became possible owing to certain developments in Indian rural economy. For example, growth of trade and commodity production, which we are here viewing virtually as consequences of these revenue systems. So he's saying that they might have been, so the consequences might have just come first. Let's at least entertain that idea. It might have been the case. Significantly, for this shows at once the degree of monetization and the degree of flexibility of the village community as an economic organization. The accounts were kept in cash. However, the danger in this arrangement was that the stronger and richer peasants would dominate the community and distribute the revenue demand at will among their brethren to the great detriment of the poor peasantry. Reza Riaya. Individual assessment was indeed often seen by the officials as a device to prevent such unjust distribution. Sometimes, too, the whole village could be so heavily assessed that the peasant population was threatened with slaughter and enslavement in case the revenue demand was not met, what someone was mentioning in the comment section. We may say then that in its initial impact, the tendency generated by land revenue was toward increasing stratification and pauperization, meaning absolute povertification of the poorer strata, though in the long run it pressed upon the whole peasantry as a class. Monetization could also directly or indirectly lead to pauperization. Prices could fluctuate to the great detriment of peasants as commodity producers. Moreover, most of the cash crops involved larger investments in cattle, owing to the necessity of more frequent plowing and watering, and in installations such as the sugarcane press and boilers, indigo vats, etc., and heavier risks in respect of harvest and prices. It was unlikely that poor peasants could compete with their richer brethren in the raising of such crops. In such circumstances, it was inevitable that the peasant should contract debts in order to pay the land revenue or to obtain his subsistence, food, and cattle, as a Farman of Aurangzeb put it. Once the rural market had developed to a certain degree, money lending could have extended rapidly. It is indeed likely that peasant indebtedness in Mughal India was more widespread than has hitherto been supposed. Guys, it's time for footnotes. Can someone please write down? No, it's live stream, so you all cannot comment right now. I'll have to write it down and type it out in the comment section and pin the comment. There aren't too many really. The conclusion is what it is. फुटनोट्स इस चीज के लिए लगेगा ताकि ये भी मैं ट्विटर पे पोस्ट कर सकूं. आज तो इरफान हबीब का कास्ट वाला पेपर का की नोट की टेकअवेज बहुत वायरल हुआ. हबीब ऑन कैपिटलिज्म. हाँ, तो ये एक चीज पहले मार्क करना है कि ये स्लॉटेड वाला कहाँ गया. Yeah, here, check this out. Check out this sentence. Dugna Lagan. During Mughal rule, peasant population was threatened with slaughter and enslavement. पहनने को कपड़ा नहीं होगा, खाने को रोटी नहीं होगा. We may say तो next point note करना है कि peasant indebtedness. peasant indebtedness was widespread in Mughal India. I'm sorry, I write really slow. Widespread in Mughal India, and because of which money lending increased, obviously. The ultimate effect of usury, particularly since the interest rates were extremely high, must have been to add to the burden borne by the peasantry. Hmm. Once the rural market had developed to a certain degree, money lending could have extended rapidly, and then the Mahajan insanity starts. Usury, whatever its actual forms, thus really represented exploitation of our form A type. The beneficiaries were not only zamindars, especially chaudhris and headmen, who thus added to their customary exactions, not only professional usurers, who thereby augmented their usurious capital, but also, okay, for those of you all who don't know, let's look at the exact definition of usury. Money lending, right, at unreasonably high rates of interest. So the Mahajan business. Okay. So who thus added to their customary exactions, not only professional usurers, who thereby augmented their usurious capital, but also merchants who often gave advances to the peasants to establish claims on their produce, and quite generally merchant money lenders. In the last case, usury could have fed merchant capital, so led to an expansion of trade. While the land revenue and monetization thus added, or at any rate increased, another means of exploitation of the peasantry in the shape of usury, they also created the conditions for increased pressure upon the peasantry from yet another source, namely the zamindar class. The pressure came first through an alteration in the substance of the zamindar's economic right, and secondly, through an expansion of the area under that right. The land revenue, as the principal claim upon the surplus, appears to have pressed upon the zamindar's fiscal claims, which were of independent origin, so much so as to annex them to itself. Hmm. These claims have reappeared as claims on the land revenue collected as a share thereof, whether as Malikana or Nankar or both. And the Zamindar was transformed into an intermediary, for example, Talukdar, the famous Bengali Hindu surname today. For example, Talukdar responsible for the collection of the revenue and its payment to the authorities, which is why I've been saying that any surname today that ends with Dar means they were employees in the Mughal government. As a result, the zamindars found themselves obliged, when the revenue demand increased, either to lose their share or to recompense themselves at the expense of the peasantry. Obviously, it is possible that the rights of the zamindars to distribute vacant lands among the peasants, or even to evict a peasant in order to install another on the land, were assumed in order to increase their authority over the individual peasants, although in conditions of land abundance, the economic significance of such rights must have been limited. There is simultaneously evidence for extension of zamindari rights over areas which were previously rayati, that is pure, which means purely peasant held without any superior rights. So this is the period when zamindars are going on stealing more and more land. I need to write this as a footnote, no, as a key takeaway then. I'm writing zamindari land accumulation increased at the expense of uh, peasants uh, during the Mughal period uh, because of unreasonable demands from the Mughal government. Land that was uh, previously peasant held. आज आज बम काहे फट रहा है कोई मैच वैच है क्या This expansion had, it would seem, two major sources. First, owing to monetization, the zamindari right became a fully saleable commodity, at least from the 16th century onward. This meant that new elements, including a small section of the nobles and officials and cavalry troopers and revenue grantees, or in other words, persons who obtained their wealth initially out of the distribution of land revenue, purchased zamindaris. What the fuck? Purchased zamindaris. Urban merchants did not yet seem to have found in zamindari purchase a suitable avenue for investment of their superfluous capital. But rural usurers, meaning the Mahajans, sometimes converted their capital into zamindari right. Holy shit. I once dated a Kayastha girl who told me this is exactly what their ancestors did. Ah, she had told me that she was a Kshatriya Kayastha. I said that no, all you Kayasthas make up this story that all of you were Kshatriyas and etc. Then she said that no, we used to be zamindars, we used to be moneylenders. Then we became zamindars. Uh, no. She said that they used to be moneylenders. So I said that okay, that's how you all probably acquired a lot of land and therefore got called zamindars and therefore declared yourself Kshatriyas. So you see, that's what happened. Our surnames, even to this day, are such repositories of history. So again, buying your caste, guys. Uh, Mahajans bought their way into zamindari. Such a market in land rights not only contributed to the increasing heterogeneity of the zamindar class, hitherto comprising in the main distinct castes and clans, but also placed larger quote unquote capital at the disposal of that class as a whole. This should have enabled the zamindars either to expand the area under them by organizing new peasant settlements or to buy out established peasant rights and convert them into zamindari. Bought out the peasants. That almost seems fair. It's at least better than money lending and the never-ending interest rates. Okay. Secondly, the increasing economic differentiation and social stratification within the peasantry could lend to the emergence of a dominant section, mukaddams, headmen, etc., whose claims might in time grow into zamindari rights. There is thus great likelihood that the exploitation of the kinds we have grouped under Form A steadily intensified during the Mughal period, causing a crisis in peasant agriculture. We know that the peasants' flight from the land, meaning leaving the land and going away, was a common phenomenon of the 17th century, being noticed by both Indian and foreign observers, and it is indeed possible that there was a net decline in cultivation over the period. Holy shit. This is insane. So, Irfan Habib is saying uh, exploitation of peasants was so much that uh, that they started leaving, that they uh, how to word this, how to leave, I guess, that they left the land, but mainly that they left the land, they could not farm anymore, but more importantly, it decreased overall cultivation. It decreased overall cultivation, which would then of course lead to rise in prices of the crops, and therefore further povertification. Increased overall cultivation. Migrated, right. भाग गए basically. Many Kshatriyas in Bengal later on merged into Kayastha caste. Yeah. Before that, where were the Kshatriyas? Who were the Kshatriyas? There were no Kshatriyas in Bengal to begin with. Because the okay, yeah, the Pal dynasty, Shen dynasties were Kshatriyas, I guess. And they became Kayasthas. Kayasthas were the people who assisted the Brahmins, just were deliberately called Shudras because they were servants of the Brahmins. जब कायस्थ बनना थोड़ा रेस्पेक्टेबल बन जाता है, तब क्षत्रियाज डिसाइड देन ओके नाउ वी आर कायस्थas. Okay, Rishi is saying even foreign travelers described Mughal India as barren lands with scarce laborers. In itself, the subversion of peasant agriculture might or might not pave the way for capitalistic or semi-capitalistic farming. Some Soviet writers appear to assume that the Zamindari right already contained within itself the seeds of quote-unquote capitalistic private property. The question should perhaps be more specifically posed. Was the subversion of peasant agriculture leading not simply to a decline in the rural economy, but also to a shift from Form A to Form B of the agrarian exploitation? Because it is only out of such a shift that capitalistic relations in agricultural production and therefore capitalist property could conceivably evolve. There are two principal categories classifiable under Form B that appear to have been the most widespread, namely orchards and B, direct cultivation of agricultural land by the superior classes themselves, khudkasht. Khudkasht. Khud se kasht karna. Is it that kasht? Or this is some Arabic kasht? Orchards were laid out by members of almost all the higher classes of society, by the emperor himself, by the princes and nobles, by revenue grantees, by the zamindars, and by village headmen, and even the richer peasants. Capital invested in horticulture, therefore the quote-unquote capital invested in horticulture, thus not only came from rural sources but also from outside. The scale and economic significance of the latter, that is, the rural sources, should not be underrated. The king and the nobles laid out orchards not only to secure fruits for their table, but also mainly to sell on the market, either doing it directly themselves or leasing the season's crop to professional contractors. Their investments and the yields of their orchards were both considerable, since they planted fruits from various regions, imported seeds as well as gardeners, laid out expensive systems of irrigation, and improved varieties of fruits, especially mangoes and oranges, by propagating grafting techniques. The pull of the urban market, together with revenue concessions, should also have encouraged the rural classes, principally the revenue grantees and zamindars, in taking to horticulture. The rapid acclimatization of some new fruits introduced from the New World, for example, New World meaning the colonization and stuff. For example, pineapple might also have contributed to the expansion of fruit growing in some areas. But however extensive might have been the expansion of horticulture, it cannot be regarded as having been at any time an alternative to peasant agriculture. And while its expansion sheds much light on the growth of market relations and commodity production in the countryside, it has little bearing on the possibilities of the genesis of capitalistic agriculture. In this respect, it is the other category under Form B that we have mentioned, namely the khudkasht form mode of cultivation, which is of much greater importance. The term khudkasht literally means self-cultivated, but it has a distinct technical meaning attached to it. Headmen who organized khudkasht, it is stated in a reliable account that quote employ laborers as their servants and put them to the tasks of agriculture, and making them plow, sow, reap, and draw water out of the well. They pay them their fixed wages, whether in cash or grain, while appropriating to themselves the gross produce of cultivation. The most interesting feature of khudkasht is the use of hired labor. Although slavery existed in Mughal India, it was almost universally domestic slavery. Semi-servile relations in agriculture existed sometimes, but in certain regions only, like parts of Bihar. And labor services for agricultural or semi-agricultural purposes were not exacted, except perhaps in Kashmir, being confined mainly to the transport of baggage and other non-economic operations. Hmm. Let's keep these key takeaways as well. Mughals kept personal slaves. इरफान हबीब ने क्या क्या धोती खोले थे उन दिनों में. The relative absence of the use of unfree labor in production is perhaps to be explained by the presence of a very large class of landless laborers who could be called upon to work in the fields in return for the provision of their barest needs of subsistence. The existence of this large class in conditions of land abundance did not derive initially or in the main from any failure of peasant cultivation, but from a social structure maintained by custom and force. The landless belonged to the menial castes and compelled to serve the interests alike of peasants and of superior cultivators, and forming therefore a vast rural semi-proletariat maintained entirely through non-economic compulsions. प्यूरिटी पोल्यूशन का अंडरस्टैंडिंग अगर नैरेटिव के बेसिस पे सोसाइटी चलने लगे तब तो ये होगा. In time, however, their numbers could have been added to by caste peasants who, unable to pay the revenue, abandoned cultivation on their own fields. This rural proletariat was not a creation of the Mughal period, but was the legacy of centuries. Cultivation by superiors could also have come down from earlier times, during which we actually catch glimpses of it here and there. It could have easily prevailed in a natural economy or in one where production was directly for use. But there are reasons to believe that in Mughal India, much of such superior or khudkasht cultivation was being linked to the market, and that in this way it was incorporating into itself another essential element of capitalistic farming besides the use of wage labor, namely commodity production. We have already noted how the cultivation of cash crops generally required a larger investment than an ordinary peasant could afford, so that these were precisely the crops in the production of which farming on a larger scale could have economic superiority over small peasant farming. Similarly, the bigger men could also have easier access to credit and to the market. The extreme limit of commercialization of superior agriculture was reached when at Bayana, the great center of indigo trade, quote, rich and substantial merchants turned into farmers, producing the commodity in which they dealt. It may also be mentioned that cash wages, which the description of khudkasht quoted above refers to, could not have been paid unless the employers sold at least a portion of the produce on the market. The classes that carried on Khudkasht were principally the zamindars and village headmen, and also revenue grantees and revenue officials. It is noticeable that the nobility whose members showed such interest in horticulture almost never undertook the establishment of agricultural farms. Their lack of interest in agriculture is also reflected in contemporary Persian works on horticulture and agriculture, where much the larger space is given to the former and relatively little is said about the latter. So much is given to horticulture, not too much land is given to much, not even is too much said about agriculture. The merchant farmers, such as those at Bayana, were also exceptions, and as a general rule, mercantile classes do not appear to have assumed the role of agriculturalists. We may therefore suppose that, by and large, the capital for Khudkasht came out of the accumulations of the rural superior classes themselves. Unfortunately, we have no statistical information about the area under Khudkasht for its expansion, that it did in fact expand, and in the course of such expansion, it pressed upon peasant cultivation, is suggested by official bans upon the conversion of peasant cultivated lands, Rayat Kashta, into their Khudkashta by revenue guarantees and revenue officials. Revenue grantees, okay? Listen to this sentence once again. The fact that it did in fact expand in the course of such expansion, it pressed upon peasant cultivation is suggested, okay, in the course of such expansion it pressed upon peasant cultivation is suggested by official bans upon the conversion of peasant cultivated lands, that is the Rayat Kashta, into their Khud Kashta by revenue grantees and revenue officials. Insofar as Khudkasht, organized for commodity production, comes closest to capitalistic farming, its expansion at the expense of peasant agriculture would have great significance for us. But there seem to be certain strong reasons why such an expansion on a very large scale cannot be easily postulated. For one thing, other conditions such as imposition of land revenue remaining the same, it is difficult to believe that in crops other than cash crops, the Khudkasht could have compared with peasant cultivation in productivity per acre. Moreover, whether under cash crops or under ordinary crops, personal supervision in Khudkasht would become less and less effective as its area expanded. The peasants who cultivated lands in their own village were, in post-Mughal times, so far as our present evidence goes, termed Khudkasht peasants, as against those who cultivated outside their village Paikasht. This usage has, of course, nothing to do with the Khudkasht that we are here considering. Nuska Dar Fani Falahat and Aligarh Litton Forsia. Okay. This work was written during the earlier half of this. Okay. Accordingly, the expansion of an individual unit of Khudkasht beyond a certain size would have become uneconomical. Finally, since the entire quote-unquote capital for Khudkasht came from the rural classes alone, it could not show such improvements in production as horticulture under royal and aristocratic auspices did, owing largely to heavier investment. So there was more investment in horticulture. It does not therefore seem possible to argue that the increasingly heavy pressure of direct appropriation, form A, upon the peasant in conditions of extensive commodity production led to a substantial or critical increase of appropriation through control over production, which is form B. In other words, the subversion of peasant agriculture did not lead directly to a semi-capitalistic form of agriculture. What seems to have happened instead is that the economic crisis transformed itself into a political crisis, marked by agrarian uprisings, often under Zamindar leadership, bringing about in the end the collapse of the Mughal Empire, and with it the weakening of several aspects of the economic and social structure that it had sustained. It would be interesting to seek parallels in Chinese history, where too the repeated agrarian crisis resulted in cycles of massive peasant revolts that overthrew dynasties but did not lead to the rise of capitalism. Now, chapter 2 in this paper. Let me change the position of the... From the agrarian economy, we may now transfer our attention to the non-agricultural sector. Since capitalism alters fundamentally the relationship between these two sectors, Increasing phenomenally the non-agricultural industrial production, it is natural to look for the signs of the beginnings, or at any rate the seeds of capitalism, in conditions that obtained in the non-agricultural sector of the economy. One of the many difficulties that face the student of the economic history of Mughal India is the lack of quantitative information, especially the lack of census data of almost any type, enumeration of inhabitants in general, enumeration by profession or by income or by property. It is therefore not surprising that we should not be able to establish directly from our evidence the relative size of the population dependent on the non-agricultural sector, the proportion of such population that lived in the towns or was engaged in craft industries. We cannot decide that what were the numbers. One must draw such inferences as one can from other largely indirect evidence. The surplus taken away from the peasant in the form of land revenue, other dues, and claims by superiors came to about a half of the produce in most areas. Superficially, this fact may be taken to suggest that as many mouths could be fed outside the agricultural sector as within it, or in other words, that the population in the non agricultural sector amounted to a half of the total. But one would be assuming then that the physical composition of the surplus was the same as that of the portion retained for subsistence of the peasant and the agricultural laborer. In actual, oh, right. Physical composition of the surplus was the same as the portion retained for subsistence. In actual fact, it is possible that a much larger portion of the surplus produce alienated by the peasant consisted of superior food crops, for example, wheat, high quality tobacco, and raw materials, for example, cotton, indigo, sesame. It is to be borne in mind that owing to the high prices fetched by the cash crops, the cash return from an acre sown with them would have been much greater than that of an acre under ordinary food grain crops, right? This may be seen from the following tabulation, which compares cash return on various crops in the same locality in the years from 1595 and 1922. Okay, just to show you all the table, check this out. Food grains 1595, 1922. What are the units? So increase in bajra in 1922, decrease in barley, decrease in rice, wheat stays at the same spot. And in terms of cash crops, again wheat stays the same spot. Cotton decreases largely, sesame decreases, sugarcane data not available. This tabulation shows that in 1595, not only was the value of the return on the cash crops per acre much higher than on wheat, and on wheat much higher than on the other food crops, but also that the relative value of the return on the cash crops was much higher in 1595 than during this century. This would imply that a relatively small acreage under cash crops would have yielded in value a far larger proportion of the total produce. Thus, for example, while the area under cash crops, sugarcane and cotton is estimated at 8% of the total area sown for the autumn harvest in a pargana in eastern Rajasthan in 1690, as against 72.9% under food grains, the percentage in terms of the value of the total produce work out at 32.6% and 60.6% respectively. A change in the physical composition of the surplus, especially if it involved a reduction in the food grain component, would have considerable effect on the size and composition of the non-agricultural population if the food grain component was practically the same in the surplus as in the portion of the produce retained for subsistence. Then it follows A. The population in the non-agricultural sector bore roughly the same proportion to the agricultural population as the surplus bore to the remainder of the produce, and its consumption approximated to subsistence level. B. The fraction of the population engaged in industrial or craft production would be very small, since about the same amount of raw materials would be retained for meeting the needs of the peasants as for meeting those of the population fed out of the surplus. Finally, the overwhelmingly large portion of the population in the non-agricultural sector should therefore have been engaged in unproductive labor or personal service. It was therefore likely to have been heavily dispersed and ruralized. This, let us say, is phase one. If, on the other hand, the surplus contained a higher portion of the yield of the cash crops, and as we have seen, yield accounting for a very high portion of value could have come from a very small acreage. A, therefore, then, the size of the non agricultural sector in terms of population would have been much smaller than the relative size of the appropriated agricultural surplus. B, within this population, a much larger section would be engaged in productive labor, that is, the crafts. And C, the non agricultural population would probably tend to be concentrated in cities, so that there should have been an urban population of considerable size. Obviously, from the point of view of the emergence of capitalism, phase one may be regarded as representing the more backward stage, and a high development of non agricultural production would not be possible unless phase two arrived. Capitalism can hardly be conceived of unless a minimum concentration of non-agricultural labor in cities has been achieved, and therefore a labor market created. To determine the phase with which the Mughal Indian economy had greater affinities, it would naturally be best if we could study the actual physical composition of the agricultural surplus as distinguished from the total produce. Since, however, we cannot establish what it was in quantitative terms, and it is difficult even to suggest how it can be done from our documents, the only possible alternative before us is to trace the directions in which the surplus or claims to the surplus in the form of money was channeled, and the ways in which it was consumed. From information on these matters, we may then be able to decide whether the non-agricultural sector fitted more with phase 1 or phase 2, both of which are theoretically possible for Mughal India. First of all, as we have seen, a certain portion of the surplus was left in the countryside in the shape of the fiscal dues, allowances, perquisites, etc. of the zamindars and village headmen, the claims on revenue collection by officials and men of the revenue establishments of the khalisa and jagirs, the income of the revenue grantees, the profits of usurers, mahajans, etc. Among all these local or rural claimants to shares in the surplus, the zamindars were in quantitative terms the most important. Okay. Among all these local or rural claimants to shares in the surplus, the zamindars were in quantitative terms the most important. We know little it is true of the expenditure patterns of the zamindars. What we know for certain is that either for maintaining their authority or for achieving status, they zealously pursued the ideal of possessing the largest possible number of servants and retainers. According to a detailed official census from circa 1595, the zamindars maintained within the Mughal Empire in northern India nearly 4.7 million retainers, 4.3 million infantry, and 0.3 million horsemen. There is no reason to doubt these totals, which are based on figures meticulously obtained for each locality. They suggest an almost staggeringly large number of persons, namely about 21 million, assuming an average of, by the way, infantry, standing army means different ways to get Kshatriya status even. So they suggest an almost staggeringly large number of persons, namely about 21 million, assuming an average family to be of 4.5 persons. So they are dependent upon the service of the zamindars. It is possible that many such retainers were part retainers, part peasants. Right. What is your profession? Not au. It's all I'm a potter, sir. I'm a peasant. I'm a farmer, sir. But even when this qualification has been made, the number remains impressive. Whatever might have been the total population of the Mughal Empire at the time, this would still have comprised a very high proportion of it. Using the argument we have advanced previously, we may take this large number as indicative of the fact that the expenditure of the income of the zamindars went largely to subsistence level consumption and could not have generated a very large demand per head in the non-agricultural rural sector for the products of craft industries. This ought not to be taken to mean, though, that they did not generate any additional demand whatsoever for such goods. The same 1595 statistics show that the zamindars of Bengal were possessed of 4,260 pieces of cannon and 4,400 boats, and these at least were products fashioned by smiths and carpenters. But we may suppose on the whole that the share in the surplus exacted by the zamindars accorded largely with the conditions of what we have designated phase 1. However, zamindars only commanded a part of the surplus. We have seen in the previous section that after allowing for all leakages, quote unquote, the net revenue collection taken completely outside the sphere of rural economy probably accounted in value to a fourth or a third, if not a half of the total agricultural produce. This naturally dwarfed all other claims on the agricultural surplus, and from our present point of view, it is its distribution and ultimate disbursement that would be that would be of most crucial significance. The land revenue, together with income from other taxes, was distributed directly either by way of revenue assignments, jagirs, or through cash salaries paid out of the imperial treasury, which itself received the revenues from a portion of the empire, the Khalisa, among members of a small ruling class. This class consisted, beside the emperor himself, of about 8,000 mansabdars, according to an official estimate of 1647. Among these, again, there was an enormous concentration of resources. The income of 445 mansabdars amounted to 61.5% of the total revenues of the empire. And of these, again, a mere 73 or 0.9% of the total claimed for their share 37.6% of the total revenues. तो देखो, कैपिटलिज्म नहीं है, फ्री मार्केट में ही नहीं है, मगर इनइक्वालिटी है. तो जो लोग बोलते हैं कि कैपिटलिज्म की वजह से इनइक्वालिटी होता है, उनको ये पेपर पढ़ना चाहिए. द कॉन्सेंट्रेशन तो 0.9% 0.9% of total mansabdars claimed 37.6% of the total revenues. Yes, Pike and Shikdar. The Shikdar surname is therefore still exists. The concentration would appear to be substantially greater still if the income assigned to the emperor's own establishment, that is, total Khalisa revenues, less salaries paid out to mansabdars, is also taken into consideration. So here, Irfan Habib is pointing out the stark inequalities. Stark economic inequality. Rising income inequality तब नहीं था, तब मतलब तब भी था. I mean economic inequality. The actual consumption of the enormous portion of the produce appropriated as land revenue thus depended mainly upon the manner in which this small ruling class spent its income. The first claim upon their income was that of the army. Among the top 445 mansabdars, the total pay against the sour ranks, the amount from which they were expected by the emperor to maintain cavalry contingents on his behalf, came to 77.2% of their total pay, and we may well infer that while for all the 8,000 mansabdars, the percentage might have been lower than this, it could not have been much lower. It may be considered that the actual expenditure on these troops probably seldom accorded with the official expectations. The suspicion existed that the nobles really spent much less. The nobles, on the other hand, usually pleaded that while their obligation to pay the salaries of their troopers was fixed, their income fluctuated and was sometimes even uncertain owing to the transfer of jagirs. It is therefore difficult to fix the relation of the actual expenditure on the army to the total income of the nobility. It may, however, be safe to say that it was probably around 2/3. So 2/3 of the income was spent on the army. Such a large diversion of resources to the maintenance of armed men is to be expected in a system where exploitation was principally of our form A, being superimposed, that is to say, on the productive system, and so requiring for its enforcement constant use or menace of armed power. Nice. This calls for another key takeaway, bros. So, 2/3 of income of the mansabdars or Zamindar? Of the mansabdars, right, was spent on on armies in order to keep the populace at constant threat. Constant populace at constant threat of physical harm. क्या ब्रिलियंट इकोनॉमिक सिस्टम है। आहा हा, कैपिटलिज्म से कितना बढ़िया है। आजकल हावियर मिले फार राइट भोसड़ी के क्या सब कर रहा है, कितना बेटर था ये सब टाइम। To some extent, therefore, the crowds of armed retainers of the Zamindars and the enormous expenditure on the army by the Mughal ruling class were based on the same economic reality. But here the similarity ceased. Though the military expenditure in absolute figures of the Mughal ruling class was much greater than that of the Zamindars, the number of men among whom it was distributed was much smaller. So, more well paid soldiers, obviously. Oh, Mansabdars as well as Mughals. So, not just the Mansabdars, ये भी clarify हो गया. The number of men, the most complete official figures are available for 1647. There were then 7,000 cavalrymen and mounted matchlock bearers in the emperor's own establishment, and an estimated 1,85,000 horsemen maintained by the Mansabdars against their sour ranks. In addition, there was 40,000 infantry consisting of matchlockmen, gunners, cannoneers, and rocketeers. 10,000 of them posted at the capital, and the remainder in the provinces and forts. The cavalry probably accounted for the overwhelmingly larger portion of the military expenditure. Obviously, the cavalryman of the Mughal armies was really a professional gentleman trooper. In most cases, he had more than one horse. The horses were required to be of standard breeds. Since Indian breeds were notoriously indifferent, good horses were expensive, something that Abhijit Armitra had talked about on Kushal Mehra, fetching during the 18th century 4 times the price in England. And had to be constantly imported from Persia and Central Asia, क्योंकि लंबे दौड़ने का जगह चाहिए होता था घोड़े के अच्छे प्रैक्टिस के लिए एंड हेल्थ के लिए. The import of horses could naturally have created a counter demand for Indian goods. Besides this indirect support to the market for craft products, the troopers created it more directly by their demand for armor and weapons and for certain comforts and luxuries for themselves and their families. Yet they also maintained a relatively large human establishment comprising servants and slaves, so that part at least of what they received went ultimately into subsistence of level consumption. We may estimate the population dependent upon them, including their own families, at about 5 million or so. Besides cavalry, there was artillery. It is not possible to estimate the amount of metal used in the artillery of the Mughal army or the amount of gunpowder it consumed. But in view of the numbers employed in the artillery of over 40,000 men, it is certain that at any time, some tens of thousands of matchlocks, surely not less than 25,000 on these numbers, must have been in use. And we know that excessively heavy cannon were much favored in India. It is therefore likely that the increasing employment of artillery helped extensively to develop the saltpeter industry and the metallurgical and associated crafts. When Indian copper mines proved insufficient, there were heavy copper imports, which could only have been met by corresponding exports of Indian commodities. The emperor and his nobles were generous patrons of the professions and arts according to their lights. Through pensions or gifts, they maintained scholars, poets, theologians, physicians, painters, musicians, and dancers. Among the ranks of this professional middle class, quote unquote middle class, may also be counted the accountants and officials who were employed in large numbers in the nobles' establishments. 10 being employed, says Pelsart, where one would have sufficed. Okay, तो अगर एक भी चाहिए होता था तो 10 को employ करते थे. These are the naib moshais, the muzumdars, etc., majumdars, and all the later kaisers. This was also true of the vast bureaucratic apparatus of the imperial administration and the royal establishment. Many members of this middle class reproduced or tried to imitate on a smaller scale the mode of living of the nobility. Little kings obviously will emulate the bigger kings. But the total income and the pattern of expenditure of this class are both difficult to work out owing to the very heterogeneous character of the class. So not a monolith at all. If we assign 2/3 of the nobles' income to the maintenance of cavalry and artillery and about 1/10 to the support of the professional classes, probably a generous estimate, they should still have had about a fourth of their income to spend on themselves. A bit of self-care, a me time. Much of this went undoubtedly to maintain their notoriously huge establishments. For the nobles loved to spend quote unquote great sums on an extravagant display of elephants, horses, and servants. The imperial household similarly had an enormous entourage of slaves and servants serving the harem and the stables, dash dashi. We should thus expect to find a very large number of people engaged in purely unproductive services and drawing from the nobles just the minimum provision for subsistence. Holy shit, what a fascinating point. कि पूरा सोसाइटी का प्रोडक्टिविटी गड्ढे में जा रहा था क्योंकि ये लोग दिखावा के लिए इतने लोगों को भोसड़ी के हायर करके रख रहे थे. होली शिट. Let me mark this as key takeaway. Productivity of society went down because the nobles as well as the kings pointlessly hired people for non-productive. कहाँ सुनेला लगता है ये फैक्ट. नॉन प्रोडक्टिव bureaucratic jobs on just to show off. Just to show off. 9 key takeaways so far. Lots of people watching. I didn't expect so many. It's a pretty dense as fuck paper. It's not an entertaining paper, no. From the nobles, just the minimum provision. So, if the contemporaries marked anything else besides the nobles' love for a large train of servants and slaves, it was their love of hoarding coin and treasure. The escheat system of the Mughal. So, ये भी mark कर लेते हैं. Nobles under Mughals loved hoarding coin and treasure. Art collector. The street system of the Mughal Empire has long been misunderstood, and it has been urged that since the emperor took away the nobles' property at their death, they should have tended to be spendthrifts. The question has now been more or less satisfactorily elucidated, and it has been found that in fact the emperor's claims upon the property of a dead noble followed certain norms beyond his simple first right as a creditor. In any case, the nobles left behind vast treasure hoards. The official history refers to the emperor's acquisition of 6 millions of rupees in cash. From the property of a very high noble upon his death in 1645. मतलब आज के हिसाब में कितना होगा? 6 million Indian rupees in 1645. आज के दिन में क्या बिलियन तो होगा? बिलियन ट्रिलियन होगा शायद. Another noble, higher still in rank, left behind in cash and goods 10 millions of rupees at the official valuation in 1657. Adjusted for inflation, ये कितना होगा? Any finance guys here? The imperial treasure hoard was, in comparison, enormous. Easily in billions, right? rather exaggerated accounts circulated of what Akbar had left at his death. But we know from an official source that his treasure contained 70 millions of rupees in cash. Hoarding of treasure, especially gold and silver, created no direct demand for craft products and might be regarded as so much wastage of capital. But insofar as imports of gold and silver, like horses and copper, had to be counterbalanced by exports, such hoarding could lead indirectly to the expansion of demand for craft goods. Interesting. पहले ये फुटनोट ये की नोट लेते हैं, ये की नोट नहीं, ये की टेकअवे लेते हैं कि hoarding was so out of of the charts. Akbar hoarded 70 million rupees. At the time of his death. Hoarding of treasure, especially gold and silver, created no direct demand for craft products and might be regarded as so much wastage of capital. This hoarding led to wastage of capital. So much wastage of capital led to wastage of capital since it it prevented direct demand for gold and silver. Right. But insofar as imports of gold and silver, like horses and copper, had to be counterbalanced by exports, such hoarding could lead indirectly to the expansion of demand for craft goods. तो ये could है. As for the direct demand for goods of consumption by the nobility, a quantitative statement is not possible, but inferences may be drawn from some general evidence. The Mughal nobles were, like their emperors, great builders, and their palatial houses, for their scale and comforts, even passed the standard of the severest European critic of the time. They built, besides tombs, mosques, sarais, paved tanks, and bridges, which have survived the ravages of time better than their houses. The nobles' expenditure on articles of furniture and decoration, as well as of personal use, must have been truly great. Amidst the vast variety that was in demand, the emphasis was on the more expensive material and finer workmanship. Thus, the articles ranged from the most precious jewels to the finest muslin. Many of the articles the nobles needed came from their own workshops, karkhanas. So even this is an Arabic word, karkhana, karya karne ka khana. The imperial karkhanas have been, by the way, is karkhana a non-Bengali word as well? In Bengali, it's a day-to-day colloquial word. Factory means karkhana in Bengali. The imperial karkhanas have been better described, but meaning of the king, but they were the same in nature. A karkhana seems usually to have been a sort of hall, and there was a different one for each craft. Here, the artisans were set to work under close supervision on material provided by the noble. Almost every kind of article was turned out in these karkhanas, the products made being either for use of the master or for gifts. But it is certain that the nobles also bought finished goods on the market. Indeed, it is unlikely that the smaller nobles could have supplied themselves adequately from their own establishments. There were shops which sold the most expensive, so premium boutique products, were luxurious items were also being created. Obviously, there were shops which sold the most expensive articles for aristocratic customers. Indeed, Bernier, while disparaging the appearance of the Delhi shops, speaks of an infinite quantity of the richest commodities being collected there. Many of the goods that the nobles wanted came from abroad, particularly Persia and Central Asia. The demand for European goods was more limited and less certain. This too, as we have argued above, was an indirect way of supporting craft production through stimulating exports. Uh, oh wait, let me check some comments. कुछ अचानक बहुत सारे comments आ गए important. Let me have a break for my voice as well. Oh, so adjusted to inflation, 15.76 trillion rupees for Shah Jahan rule. Critics of capitalism are actually haters of corporate. They usually don't understand capitalism. They want to distract attention away from monopoly of big farmers and protect the power of Babudam. So well said. We was rich because this is only Mughal territory. Karkhana in UP also means small factory SME. या यूपी और बंगाल में बहुत सारे ऐसे उर्दू वर्ड्स हैं जो कि अब मतलब डेली हिंदी एंड डेली बंगाली में भी घुस गए हैं जो कि और जगह पे यूज नहीं होता है लाइक आइन कानून कानून तो हर जगह पे ही लॉ है इंडिया में आज के दिन में एटलीस्ट इन एनीवेयर वेयर एनी प्लेस इन इंडिया वेयर रिमोटली हिंदी स्पोकन बट आइन इज टुडे यूज्ड इन बंगाली एज वेल एंड आल्सो इन यूपी okay, let's continue. Fascinating. From all these general facts, can we conjure up a definite picture of the pattern of distribution of the land revenue resources, showing at least the portion that went to maintain and reproduce unproductive labor and the portion that supported craft production? With our existing evidence, definiteness can hardly be thought of, but we are probably entitled to infer that the pattern of distribution accorded with both phase 1 and phase 2 of our definition, that is to say that there were on the one hand large numbers dependent on the service of individual nobles and their troopers and hangers-on, thus giving even a city like Delhi the appearance of a camp के temporary migrant workers से भरे हैं. On the other hand, there was a substantial population of artisans and unskilled laborers employed in handicraft production and in trade and transport in order to meet the requirements of the aristocrats. In actual fact, the proportion of the artisan population should have been much higher than this number would indicate. This was because the satisfaction of the bare subsistence needs, especially for clothing of the laboring population, including those unproductively and productively employed, would call in unproductively meaning the bureaucrats, and productively employed would call into being a large class of artisans and unskilled laborers employed in production and transport. The multiplier effect must have been high, for if the manufacturers needed for subsistence per head were only of small value, the productivity per capita was also very low. ये तो कीनोट देना है. Productivity per capita was very low. ये तो direct quote है. This is what we do. We take a fine tooth comb and go through papers to find out interesting points. It is possible then that that elements of phase 2 were quite strongly established in Indian economy, though they coexisted to a certain degree with those of phase 1. We should therefore expect to have had an urban population of a considerable size, but probably amounting to less than a fifth of the total population. This is largely corroborated by our information about the size of Indian towns. Okay, urban population को ये footnote लेते हैं. Urban population during Mughal rule was less than, आजकल कितना परसेंटेज है? It was back then less than 1/5 of total population. Lawyers in Hindi are called अधिवक्ता कानून के वक्ता. अच्छा, अधिनियम. Why does this sound like UPA? Toward the beginning of the 17th century, the largest towns of Mughal India appear to have been much larger in population than the largest European towns. But during the course of that century, as the urban population in Europe grew, the largest towns in both seemed to be of equal size to contemporary European visitors. Their population estimates for some of the towns, not reliable but quoted here for all they are worth, are as follows. Okay, y'all can let's see. Check out the table, guys. Patna 1671 May 2 lakh. Agra, reputedly the largest city in 1609, had 5 lakh people. In 1629 to 1643, Agra has 6 lakh 60,000 people. Patna has in 1671 2 lakh people. Masulipatam has in 1672 has 2 lakh people. Surat in 1663 has 1 lakh people. In 1700 has 2 lakh people. We may conclude then that based on the collection of enormous revenues from the agricultural sector and their concentration in the hands of a small ruling class, the Indian economy had achieved a considerable expansion of its urban sector during the Mughal period. Not only was a high proportion of the urban population employed in industrial crafts, but it would appear that in actual volume of output per head, the period could invite comparison with the early decades of this century. ये footnote देखना पड़ेगा. Moreland, India. See Burnier's reference to the small. Babar's enthusiastic comment. Another good thing in Hindustan is that it has unnumbered and endless workmen of every kind in Babarnama, other than gold, obviously, and everything else sucked according to him. 41. 41 hai ke we should therefore expect to have had an urban population of a considerable size, but probably amounting to less than a fifth of the total population. This is based on the simple inference that the non-agricultural population maintained on the net revenue collection would have amounted to a fourth or a third of the whole if there had been no difference in the physical composition of the surplus taken as revenue and of the remainder. But since craft production accounted for a significant portion of consumption in the non-agricultural sector, the food grain component in the surplus must have been much smaller than in the remainder of the agricultural produce. The non-agricultural population should therefore have been much smaller as well, though it should have been more highly urbanized. Chapter 3 now. Little detailed work has been done so far on the techniques employed to obtain this large volume of production. This is, from our point of view, an extremely important matter because it is, of course, through an increasing sophistication of tools that the machine can develop in time. A common feature in the tools of Indian crafts has been the extremely sparing use of metal, wood, often serving where iron might be expected. European travelers of the 17th century, therefore, found Indian implements of production rather simple and crude. Bernier even speaks of the Delhi artisan as quote-unquote destitute of tools. The development of tools seemed to be in an inverse ratio to the skill of the artisans, for in spite of indifferent tools, they yet managed to produce works of the highest quality. The development of skill involved extreme specialization. Palsat speaks of 100 crafts in Agra. Quote, for a job which one man would do in Holland, here passes through 4 men's hands before it is finished. As a result, Indian craftsmen were ought to be good at imitation, but not at designing anything themselves. Shit. However, the manufacture of certain mechanical devices such as clocks was not attempted even in imitation. There was another great deficiency. Education ka bhosra ban gaya. There was another great deficiency, the true significance of which we can see now, namely the lack of development of mining engineering. Iron ore was collected through surface excavations and coal was not mined at all. In general, there were no deep mines. The salt mines of the Salt Range excited wonder, although actually the shafts there were horizontal, going into the sides of the hills, and each shaft was excavated by an individual miner. From such facts, it would doubtless be tempting to take the view that development in production in India was more a matter of improving human dexterity than the quality of tools. However, such a view would appear to be rather naive in that while the roles of skill and tools in the productive process might vary in different societies and under different circumstances. No amount of human dexterity could substitute for certain basic tools if particular products were desired. Yeah, obviously. Thus for हाँ जितना भी डेक्स्टर बन जाओ माने मतलब गाड़ी सिंथेसाइजर ये सब थोड़ी बना पाओगे. Thus for lifting water from depth for irrigation, it was essential to have the Persian wheel, which contained toothed wheels, a gearing mechanism, and a bucket chain. In Mughal India, it was made of wood, rope, and earthen pots. The all metal machine did not come into use until the latter half of the 19th century, so late 1800s. Its substitution for the earlier machine became possible only when the additional cost of metal became less than the cost of the greater application of cattle power and labor time needed to provide the same amount of irrigation from the less efficient wooden machines. There was little question of any basic improvement in the technical principles of the mechanism. Similarly, the ordinary spinning wheel included in it two important mechanical devices, namely belt transmission of power and flywheel principle, though it was entirely made of wood. In the other Indian crafts, the wheel was used for boring and for cutting and polishing metals and precious stones. Thus, while it is true that extensive development in technology can only occur when metal, particularly iron, replaces other materials, this change may be delayed in a particular situation for no other reason than that a tool of lower efficiency can be used to manufacture the same commodity by employment of cheap skilled labor. Thus, Pelsat attributes the relatively high degree of skill specialization itself to the low wages prevailing in India. Fuck. So true. This change may be delayed in a particular situation for no other reason than that a tool of lower efficiency can be used to manufacture the same commodity by employment of cheap skilled labor. The crucial question would then be whether in cases whether it was not possible to substitute skilled labor for improved tools and devices, the latter were yet rejected. In this respect, a study of the manufacture of artillery, the real quote unquote heavy industry of the time, both in Europe and in Asia, is likely to be the most instructive. The requirements of this industry led to the manufacture of cast iron in Europe. In India, while heavy brass guns were cast, all iron guns, together with many brass guns, were not cast but were made of welded bars hoop rounds, so kattas. Yet in Orissa, where iron was reported to be plentiful, they cast anchors of iron for ships in molds, though the quality was stated to be not so good as that of cast iron made in Europe. It is also noteworthy that during the 17th century, there was little dissatisfaction with the quality and efficiency of the artillery pieces manufactured in India. Bernier, for example, praises Indian muskets and fowling pieces for their excellence. There is also evidence of a conscious effort at mechanical innovation in the curious devices of Akbar's minister Fazlullah Shirazi, though there was in them little of economic significance. There was therefore in India no rigid barrier to technological innovation or adaptation. If during the 17th century it had begun visibly to fall behind Europe in its level of industrial development, the cause of this must be sought for in factors other than a mystic predilection for manual skill. One possible explanation has been so no Dumontian ways of thinking. One possible explanation has been found by some in the social institution that sustained craft specialization in India, namely the caste system. It has been held, and the opinion has been powerfully reinforced by Max Weber, that the caste system put a severe brake on economic development through separating education from craft, segregating skills, preventing intercraft mobility, and killing or restricting individual ambition in the artisan. There are good grounds, however, for throwing doubt on this entire theory because it depends. अब इरफान हबीब मैक्स वेबर से बड़ा आरएसएस का दल्ला बन गया है कि बोल रहा है कि no even caste was not responsible for this lack of ambition, for it depends so largely on one's assumptions of how a caste system perfectly based on the law books should have operated. Yes, Irfan Habib always says no one operates perfectly based on law books, so Manusmriti is not to be blamed. Holy shit, ये तो बहुत बढ़िया की टेक अवे होने वाला है. Max Weber, wrong to assume that caste caused the lack of economic development since uh, since castes uh, did not operate perfectly based on the Hindu law books. Lol. मैंने सोचा था ज्यादा ज्यादा कीटे कवच नहीं होगा, बहुत हो गया. Three or four points ought to be borne in mind. First, the mass of ordinary or unskilled people formed a reserve from which new classes of skilled professions could be created when the need arose. Thus, diamond miners in the Carnatic must have come from the ranks of the peasantry or agricultural laborers, for when some mines were abandoned, the miners went quote unquote back to village. So you see, no one was going to be following caste to the book, or definitely not as rigidly. क्योंकि काम ही नहीं है तो कास्ट कैसे मेंटेन करेंगे. Secondly, in any region there was often more than one caste following the same profession, so that where the demand for products of a craft expanded, new caste artisans could normally be drawn to that place. More important still, the castes were not eternally fixed in their attachment to single professions or skills. Over a long period, economic compulsions could bring about a radical transformation in the occupational basis of a caste. Castes not rigid depended on economic compulsions. A well-documented case is that of the caste of tailors in Maharashtra, a section of which took to dyeing and another to indigo dyeing early in the 18th century, Bombay dyeing. Finally, there is evidence that sometimes at least administrative action was in favor of keeping the gates to the professions open. Aurangzeb ordered that at Ahmedabad, all persons who so wished should be allowed to learn the crafts of weaving, needle making, and embroidery. It seems that castes were sometimes not even as strong as guilds, for owing to their comparatively loose organization, they had often to depend upon the support of the administration or to suffer its interference in their internal affairs. Castes were so not rigid that administration had to interfere. Holy shit. That administration had to support and interfere in the caste. और यहाँ पे लोग बैठ के मनुस्मृति चला रहे हैं. Interfere in the caste. Holy shit. So, you see, the caste system, in fact, was benefiting the kings to such an extent that it was the administration saying कि नहीं caste maintain करो. Fuck. Ancient in India में institutionalized money lending through temples के through that acted as catalyst to money making, value creation and improved living condition of the poor. और महाजन क्या टेम्पल में बैठते थे? मनी लेंडिंग जिसको भी किसी को भी नहीं दिया जाता था, मर्चेंट्स को दिया जाता था, सो दैट दे कम बैक एंड रिटर्न द इंटरेस्ट टू द टेम्पल एज इन द फॉर्म ऑफ गोल्ड. और अगर इम्प्रूव लिविंग कंडीशन ऑफ द पुअर हुआ था तो इट मीन द कंडीशन ऑफ द पुअर वाज बैड टू बिगिन विथ. तो हाउ वाज इट बैड? बिकॉज टेम्पल्स existed for more than what we're talking about, the time period we're talking about. We may infer, therefore, that caste did not represent an insurmountable obstacle to the mobility of craft labor. ये तो कोट जाना होगा, ये तो पूरा कोट करना है. Caste did not represent an insurmountable, जो होगा कैस्ट सिस्टम के वजह से, insurmountable obstacle to the mobility of craft labor. काम है, करना पड़ेगा, इसमें क्या है. It is significant that while European merchants and travelers repeatedly speak of the hereditary nature of skilled occupations in India, they do not ascribe to this cause the shortage of labor in any branch of production. On the other hand, they usually refer to the large numbers and low wages of the artisans. तो हेरिडिटरी नेचर था, मगर फिर भी मोबिलिटी था. It's a complex situation. A much greater impediment to the free supply of craft labor appears to have been the nobles' extortion of forced labor upon the artisans and other forcible restraints placed upon them. So, reason instead was nobles' extortion. Having established then that there was a large urban market for non-agricultural goods and a division of labor based on skilled specialization, coupled with certain technological advances and the superfluity rather than scarcity of skilled labor, it is desirable to inquire how far in these conditions the organization of production had progressed toward capitalistic or semi-capitalistic forms. We may exclude from our consideration such artisan production as was directed to supplying the needs of peasants and village communities. Some of these artisans lived in the village and offered set products and services in return for set remuneration. Others went from village to village to buy materials and sell their wares with the prices possibly fixed in kind. In neither of these forms would real commodity production have taken place. It was otherwise with the urban artisan. We find him usually a commodity producer placed in either of two different situations. In the first, he is the master of his product until he sells it on the market. In the second, the material may remain in his hands until the productive process is completed, but all this time it is not his but someone else's. Of the first situation, we may cite for an example the English Factors report from Patna in 1620. Okay, let's check this footnote. The usual custom of buying the कितना बड़ा footnote है? हाँ. The usual कहाँ गया? अरे where did we go? Oh, अच्छा ये तो कोट है, ये फुटनोट नहीं है. हाँ. So, quote, the usual custom of buying the amberty calicos at Lahore, which is the Penthe or fair for that commodity, and is a town 14 course, 14 course from this place, is as follows. They are daily brought from the neighboring Ganges by the weaver, from whom they are brought raw, that is without being whited and stretched. ये है क्या चीज? एम्बर्टी लैकेलिकोज of length 13 coveds Jahangire, and the abatements and disturies, देखते हैं footnote, dasturi, अच्छा, the dasturis in buying them raw from weavers. Ghazi Jahangiri is a unit, 40, somewhere between 40 and 40.5 inches. In buying them raw from the weavers for 16th per rupee or 25%. In this manner, by report, daily may there be bought 50, 60, and some days 100 pieces. Almost in the like nature are they sold here in Patna, being likewise brought thence by the weavers, but ready whited and cured. Here we find the weavers producing the calicos on their own account in anticipation of the demand. What is still more interesting is that they sometimes enlarge their investment, quote unquote investment, by having their product, quote unquote, cured by washers, a process taking, according to the same report, 3 months and costing 3 rupees for 20 pieces. Weavers who arranged for such processing themselves must have been able to sell their wares dearer on the larger market. Enrichment through such ventures might in time have enabled some weavers to expand their production by no longer confining it to the household but engaging apprentices and servants. This would have been an important development, possibly representing a step in the evolution of capitalism from below the revolutionary way, according to Marx. But of such development, there is little evidence in Mughal India. Possibly trade in the precious metals yielded a sufficiently large margin of profit to goldsmiths for them to set up karkhanas or workshops. But in general, in the various crafts, there were only very few independent master craftsmen of any substance. In the second situation, the artisans did not undertake production of their own, but on behalf of merchants and others. उनके लिए बनाते थे. When the merchants wished to have supplies of particular commodities according to their specifications at fixed rates and at stipulated times, they advanced money to artisans who bound themselves to fulfill these conditions. This system of advances appears to have prevailed all over India, though it was probably more extensive in commodities required for long distance trade than in others. Under this system, the artisan was left to buy the material himself, but such processes as washing and dyeing naturally required that the material after being sold to the merchant should again be given out. From this, the next step would have been for the merchant to provide yarn to the weavers as well, and it is possible that the practice was actually adopted by the English factors in Gujarat. In Bengal, the English found it cheaper to discontinue cash advances to weavers and instead to buy the silk raw and then give it out to the weavers. The reason for this was said to be that the latter, out of poverty, could not buy raw silk of the requisite quality even when granted advances. It can be seen, therefore, that the putting out system was widely in use and that both cash advances and the giving out of the raw material were established practices. Beside the forms corresponding to the putting out system, there existed forms of productive organization corresponding to the manufactory. So, proto-capitalism. It goes without saying that the large architectural monuments and other buildings of the Mughal period could not have been built without large numbers of craftsmen and ordinary laborers being assembled together and made to work under unified supervision. Yet this assemblage must generally have remained accidental, breaking up when the work of construction was over. जैसे कि आज के फ्लैट व्लैट बनाने में होता है. The same could also have been the case with shipbuilding. Though some of the heaviest seagoing ships were built in India, it is possible that the organization brought into being to build a particular ship did not survive its construction. Achha. Contractual job. More significant for potential capitalistic development was the assembling of numbers of artisans and laborers for continuous production. Tavernier's Tavernier's detailed description of diamond mines in the Deccan shows that the fields were divided up among plots leased by individual merchants, who then employed laborers, of which the number on a plot might be as high as 300. In all, 60,000 laborers are said to have been employed. A similar form of organization prevailed in the saltpeter industry. These do not yet bring us to manufactories proper, but for though merchants are here seen as large scale producers, the productive process involved neither specialized skill nor complex tools. The real counterpart of the manufactories was the karkhana. The royal karkhanas at Delhi are thus described by Bernier, quote, varnishers in lacquer work in a fifth, joiners, turners, tailors, and shoemakers in a sixth, manufacturers of silk, brocade, and those fine muslins. The artisans repair every morning to their respective karkhanas, where they remain employed the whole day, and in the evening return to their homes. In this quiet and regular manner, their time glides away. End quote. Wow, what a life! Before the rise of income inequality, because of capitalism. The karkhanas thus Mughals also kept the karkhanas near their capital so that they can better control the proliferation of cannon technology. The karkhanas thus reflected the specialized skills developed outside reflected the specialized skills developed outside, but they converted the artisan, previously an independent or contract producer, into a wage laborer. It is likely that he still retained ownership of his tools or some of them, and it is not certain that there was any such further detailed division of skilled labor as developed within the European manufactory. And we have noted the karkhanas of the emperor and the nobles did not undertake commodity production, but production of luxury articles directly for use. This naturally set limits to their economic significance, but at least one royal establishment was different, namely the mint. The Mughal coinage was free, that is, it was open to anyone to take silver bullion and get it coined into rupees, which were of practically pure silver, on payment of seigniorage and mint charges. The output of these mints was considerable. The Surat Mint, for example, once turned out 30,000 rupees a day for the English alone. We must therefore imagine the mints to have been very large establishments where men of different skills had to work together under the closest supervision. The very fact that contemporary observers were so greatly impressed by the royal and aristocratic karkhanas, while they had nothing or little to say about similar establishments maintained by the merchants, suggests that the latter were far smaller in size. Bernier's reference to quote unquote rich merchants and tradesmen who pay the workmen rather higher wages probably applies to such private manufactories. In certain trades, such as the silk trade in Bengal, it appears to have been more economical for the bigger merchants like the English to undertake the process of winding, dyeing, and cleaning the raw silk in their own premises. But on the whole, it would seem that despite the development of manufactories in the non-mercantile sector, the characteristic form of advanced commodity production had not yet proceeded beyond the putting out system. The advance from the putting out system to the commodity producing manufactory would undoubtedly have represented an important stage in the progressive control of labor by capital. That it did not really occur in Mughal India except sporadically is perhaps largely to be attributed to the better adaptability of domestic industry to excessive exploitation of labor. Better adaptability of domestic industry to excessive exploitation of labor. The paid labor of the domestic artisan included the labor of his wife and children, an advantage that would be lost in the merchant's manufactory. Fuck. Dark. This is a huge point. इतना तो मैं अब लिख नहीं पाऊंगा, मगर ये पूरा का पूरा लाइन कोट करना पड़ेगा. excessive exploitation of labor. Page 39. Yes, Sarah Sridharan, that centralization is the difference between the Tokugawa period of capitalism and the Mughal period. I was having this discussion right before starting the live stream with Mr. Sociologist. That therefore, casteism remained in Mughal India. Whereas in Tokugawa period, it was not, the centralization was not there, even though because the samurais stayed in the cities. So even if they would have wanted to keep the Japanese caste system alive, they could not. The merchants would not therefore have found it profitable to establish karkhanas given out to the artisans, or was too heavy, or the process of production was too short to justify the distribution of the material. Mughal India then had extensive commodity production without showing much trace of the emergence of industrial capital. Since to a number of scholars, the distinction between merchant capital and industrial capital is one of degree, and not of essence. It is necessary to inquire whether the absence of industrial capital did not stem from a lack of development of merchant capital. Holy shit. So at least may have. Absence of industrial capital may have happened because of the lack of the development of merchant capital. A strong body of scholarly opinion has held that merchants in Mughal India could not obtain sufficient or secure profits and accumulate wealth owing to various political and administrative causes, i.e., the insecurity of roads, the insecurity of merchants' property, it being threatened constantly by the avarice of the emperor and his nobles, the high taxes, and finally the interference with the conduct of free trade by the Mughal officials who established their monopoly in various lines of trade within the area under their jurisdiction. Fuck. अरे इरफान हबीब को क्या हुआ था भाई उस वक्त? क्या इससे इससे ओपन गाली क्या देगा मुगल्स को? कि भोसरी क्या ऐसा एक्सप्लॉयटेशन किया, ऐसा एक्सप्लॉयटेशन किया, ऐसा सेंट्रलाइजेशन किया, ऐसा चुतियापा, ऐसा एक्सटॉर्शन किया कि मर्चेंट कैपिटल डेवलप नहीं कर पाया, which could have led to industrial capital. Fuck. Exploitation, extortion by Mughal rulers led to stagnation in merchant capital, and therefore if not stagnant, merchant capital, therefore no industrial capital could happen. Shit. Fuck. This is scathing. This is scathing. Indian government before reforms. He's describing Indira regime. It's a small world after all. It will not be of much use to go into the details of the evidence that can be cited to urge the acceptance of this view. What is in dispute is really not whether the factors mentioned operated at all, but the extent to which they did so. For example, the security of roads can hardly be considered as non-existent if an individual traveler met with robbers. The best indicator to private security, mercenaries hire kar lete hain. The best indicator of the degree of security should be the inland insurance rates. The few rates available are quoted below. The distance between the points here given is not road distance, but as the crow flies. Wow, wow, wow. क्या educated society है. Table देख लो. 1646 treasure Daman to Surat 60 miles के लिए insurance 1%. Fuck. 1647 commercial goods के लिए अहमदाबाद to थट्टा 315 miles, इंश्योरेंस 0.5%. 1655 में कोचिनील कौन सा जगह है? सूरत to Agra 550 miles, 2.5%. Fuck. 1655 कैश मसली ये सब इंश्योरेंस चार्जेस है, ठीक है. मसूलीपट्टम टू सूरत 675 miles, 1%. কোচিন, রাইট, কোচিনিল, প্রবাবলি কোচিন. দাদা এই পেপারটা আর জাপানের কাস্ট সিস্টেমের যেটা পড়লে এগুলো থেকে যা জানতে পারলে ওটা নিয়ে একটা আলাদা ভিডিও বানাবে বাংলাতে. ওকে, দেন উইল নিড মিস্ট্রি অফ সোশিয়োলজিস্ট. গুড আইডিয়া. Keep reminding though, okay, or tag us on Twitter, okay, as well. Mr. Sociologist is his Twitter handle is Abeoe. You'll see I have tagged him many times in different posts. That handle is Mr. Sociologist. Okay, so surely these rates do not suggest any stifling of commerce through quote-unquote political instability. At the present state of our knowledge, we cannot provide similar quantitative tests for the other propositions, but this particular case may be taken as a warning against the dangers of generalizing from a few bits out of a very large mass of evidence. What we know in positive terms is that merchant capital was considerable in size and that an efficient system of credit not only enlarged it, but also gave it great mobility. Okay. So I made a mistake. The last footnote was scholarly opinion, which he is debunking. Let's see then. What is his substitute? Let's see. At the present state of our knowledge, we cannot. Yeah, ye to ho gaya. What we know in positive terms is that merchant capital was considerable in size and that an efficient system of credit not only. Okay, ye enlargement hoga. Okay, so the last footnote, pura puri, cancel. I misread it. The vast system of agrarian exploitation that the Mughal Empire represented was based, as we have seen, on the large drain of food grains and other agricultural produce from the countryside to the towns. Ye hai point then. The supplies were largely marketed, and in some cases, the peasants themselves brought the supplies to the local market. But whether the peasants sold the grain in his village or at the nearest fair or in the urban market, the merchant usually took over. The importance of the grain trade in Indian commerce may be judged from the simple fact that the term bakkal or grain merchant, bakkal, was employed in Indo-Persian as the name for the banya, the traditional Indian merchant. For the long-distance carrying trade, there had developed the famous nomadic class of Banjaras, who first appear in our records during the 14th century. During the 17th century, they probably carried many hundreds of thousands of tons of agricultural produce across most regions of the country. The total capital involved in the trade in agricultural produce cannot be computed, but must surely have been enormous. In urban commodity production, many artisans must have been selling directly to the consumers. Some worked for the nobles, producing goods directly for use. This would have restricted the limits of the operations of merchants, but not perhaps to a very great extent. In any case, in the trade of all valuable commodities, especially those for the long-distance market, we find merchants buying up large quantities from the artisans. For the size of the capital involved in these dealings, we may cite the information we have about the merchants of Surat from European sources. It was stated in 1663 that the Surat merchants were, quote-unquote, very rich, some of them worth more than 5 or 6 millions of rupees. They had 50 ships trading with various overseas countries. Virji Vora, reputedly the richest Surat merchant at that time, was said to have an, quote-unquote, estate of 8 million rupees. Subsequently, another merchant, Abdul Ghafur, was said to be worth the same sum, and it was reported that he possessed 20 ships of between 300 and 800 tons each. He alone conducted trade equal to that of the whole English East India Company. Fuck. It is not to be supposed that Surat was exceptional in respect of its merchants' wealth. Interesting. A well-traveled European visitor said that three great surprises at Agra, one was the quote-unquote immense wealth or fortune of the merchants. And the writer alleged that he saw such vast sums of money piled up in some houses that they looked like grain heaps. There is little doubt then that in spite of certain unfavorable factors, the wealth accumulated by Indian merchants was considerable. Uh, okay, but it doesn't mean that there was no extortion from the Mughal government, because he himself said that some evidence doesn't mean all evidence. But okay, he's going to give some other reason. He's saying that there were some certain unfavorable factors, but there were still some rich merchants. किसने क्या हाथ में, तो इट्स लाइक सेइंग कि सोशलिज्म नहीं हुआ इंडिया में 1991 से पहले क्योंकि टाटा थे, बिरला थे. That's the sort of argument here. So we can't put that as a key takeaway from this paper, because Habib doesn't say it. Habib is disagreeing with that idea. Beside the wealth of merchants, we may also count the sums invested in commerce by nobles. The outstanding example of beside the wealth of merchants, we may also count the sums invested in commerce by nobles. The outstanding example was Mir Jumla, one of the greatest merchants of the time and also one of the premier nobles of the Mughal Empire. The nobles had little hesitation in turning money to profit if the opportunity arose, and they even speculated in the financing of ship cargoes. But in many cases, when their investment was combined with monopoly imposed by coercion, the investment can hardly be regarded as an addition to the fund of commercial capital. On the whole, it would appear that compared to their enormous resources, the Mughal nobles made very few investments in commerce. ये तो की नोट देना पड़ेगा, की टेकअवे. Mughal nobles made very few investments in commerce. Very few investments in commerce. These merchants used to earn 100 to 1200% in margins in their overseas trade, so of course they'll be rich, and then they were not investing in commerce. A patriotic Indian during the 17th century could justly take pride in the system of credit and banking that prevailed in India, even though credit is haram, right? Tavernier remarks that in India, a village must be very small indeed if it has not a money changer called Shroff, so Jackie Shroff's caste, Saraf, who acts as banker to make remittances of money and issue letters of exchange. The Sarafs not only transmitted money through their own hundis, bills, but by discounting the merchants' hundis, they financed commerce, particularly long distance and international trade, to a very large extent. So brisk was the use of these bills that in the Ahmedabad market, merchants made their payments or adjusted their obligations almost entirely through transfer of paper. The prevalence of the system is shown also by the fact that almost any order of payment by anyone, such as a noble's order of payment of salaries to his troops, could become commercial paper. Discounted by the Sarafs. He's saying the same thing in another way. According to me, Mughal used monopoly. The discount on hundis included the cost of insurance, since if the goods against which it was drawn were lost, the hundi could not be presented for payment. Insurance or bima to aaj bhi hai. A business also carried on by the Saraf. So Jackie Shroff was from the insurance providing caste. Was fairly well developed. Hundis, goods in transit, and cargo could all be insured. Since the Sarafs accepted deposits while they also advanced loans directly, they acted practically as deposit bankers. Acha. Medieval insurers. Thus, they appear to have acquired even sums intended for the imperial treasury as deposits on loan. It is true that they too lent large sums to quote-unquote men of quality and others at high rates, and thus converted part of their deposits into purely usurious capital. ये भी महाजन ही बन गए थे. Yet it is possible, owing to their ability to advance large loans to merchants, that some of the capital mopped up through deposits with sarafs did turn into merchant capital. Obviously, from the point of view of the development of merchant capital, Indian economy appears to have reached a fairly advanced stage. It is noticeable that 17th century European merchants and factors make no serious criticism of the Indian credit system, and there is little inclination to compare it unfavorably with the European, although most of its particularities or differences are noted. But despite all this, the Indian credit system seems practically to have been formed for the requirements of commerce alone. Thus, there was no provision for long-term investment. Rates of interest were calculated by month. A loan was not expected to be carried beyond a year, since by customary practice, the creditor could double the rate of interest on the completion of a year. Yeah, Kabuliwala. Another feature which is difficult to explain is the consistently high rates of interest prevalent in India. The rates of interest current at Surat, Ahmedabad, and Agra and in the Deccan show uniformly a sharp fall, which by comparison with other information may be assigned to the early 1640s. In northern India, there was a fall from about 1% and 1.5% per month to 3/4% or 5/8% or even 0.5%. In the Deccan, from above 2% per month to 1.5% and below. The reasons for this fall remain obscure unless it was linked up in some ways with the influx of bullion from the West. In any case, even afterward, interest rates in India remained much higher than in England, and the difference was so great that it was suggested that the English East India Company might send treasure to India solely for the purpose of being lent out at interest. The high interest rates do not suggest an intrinsically capital-starved economy. They may, on the other hand, have been due to the steady expansion of mercantile activity following upon the wider and wider imposition of the cash nexus from Akbar's reign onward. It is also possible that tradition gave the merchant a larger margin of profit on commodities than in Europe. Okay, it is also possible that tradition gave the merchant a larger margin of profit on commodities than in Europe, so that the higher interest rates represented a higher return on commercial investment, which was not greatly affected by competition. But on all these matters, we have practically no detailed information, and it will have a little merely to speculate. What we know of the Mughal Indian economy thus tends to confirm Marx's judgment that merchant capital, through its own development, cannot lead to industrial capital. Okay, he's saying that there was merchant capital, but it didn't lead to industrial capital. Quote, Marx says, "The independent and predominant development of capital as merchant's capital is tantamount to the non-subjection of production to capital, and hence to capital developing on the basis of an alien social mode of production which is also independent of it. The independent development of merchant's capital, therefore, stands in inverse proportion to the general economic development of a society." No. This is where the mistakes start seeping, because Habib is going to depend on Marx. ये बोल रहा है कि merchant capital necessarily industrial capital में translate नहीं होता है according to Marx, because merchants are such big assholes. But investment का माहौल नहीं था वहां पे because of state extortion, monopoly, violence, taxes, and general lack of safety on the roads. Finally, we may, according to me, my personal opinion, consider the impact on the Indian economy of the great changes in the patterns of international trade during the 16th and 17th centuries, following the discovery of the New World and the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope. In Europe, expansion of the overseas trade and the price revolution which accompanied it and was intensified, if not entirely caused by it, helped to create considerable shifts in the distribution of income and wealth in different countries of Europe. This had a lasting effect on the economic life of Europe, and it is possible to trace the strands of capitalism back to the changes which these developments made possible. Largely because information on the history of prices in the Mughal period has been so insufficient, a suggestion found in James Grant long remained practically unnoticed. This was that the large influx of bullion, especially silver, from the New World, meaning Portugal, France, Europe generally, through Europe was, or the discovered world. New World meaning USA or what? From the New World through Europe was bound to raise prices in India. Recent research has suggested that the increase in prices during the first half of the 17th century was so considerable as to deserve, in patches at least, the designation of inflation. In the course of the century, prices appear to have almost doubled. This is suggested by and therefore famines again start, famines and starvations. North and South America, right, right. Formation on the this is suggested by our information on the silver values of gold and copper and on the prices of major agricultural commodities. It is also confirmed by the extraordinary approximation with just the time gaps we would expect that an attempted Mughal mint output curve based on the number of catalogued coins of each year bears to the curve suggested by Hamilton's histogram for the influx of American treasure into Spain. It is therefore certain that the price revolution steadily affected India as bullion flowed through the Middle East and round the Cape of Good Hope. But to us, as important as the outcries heard in Europe against the export of bullion eastward must be the silence of Indian writers in respect to the 17th century inflation. We know of the process from the prices they quote, but they themselves are unaware of it. We know of the process from the prices they quote, but they themselves are unaware of it. It is possible that the general trend was concealed from men's eyes by the wide price fluctuations caused by the harvests each year. But this very fact suggests that the larger trend caused less economic disturbance than the annual fluctuations. It is probable that this was because neither the revenue rates nor wages were fixed in cash by custom or tradition. As we have noticed above, the Mughal authorities not only modified the cash revenue schedules when prices showed long-range changes, but could also shift from basic assessment in cash to assessment in kind, with subsequent commutation into cash at market prices. Similarly, if wages were already at subsistence level and were therefore governed directly by grain prices, they would have risen as prices rose. Here, for example, are 3 quotations of the monthly wages of the lowest paid peons or unskilled servants at Surat. अगेन टेबल दिखा देते हैं. अच्छा मैंने स्मॉल करना भूल गया था. तो ईयर 1616 वेज 2 रुपी 40 पैसे, index 100. 1623 wages 3 rupees. 1693 wages 4 rupees. Unfortunately, detailed statistics of wages and prices in the same localities have yet to be collected. It is not yet clear how the real wages of skilled laborers behaved. But we must remember that most of them, even under the system of advances, sold their wares, and the prices paid to them should have broadly followed the trends of market prices. It is therefore unlikely on the whole that the merchants reaped long-term extra profits from the 17th century inflation. In other words, insofar as we can judge in the present state of our knowledge the structure of Mughal Indian economy, weathered the effects of the worldwide price revolution without much difficulty. Our principal conclusions with regard to the extent of capitalistic development with Mughal India may now be summarized. We find that in both agricultural and non-agricultural production for the market formed a very large sector. In agriculture, there existed khudkash in cultivation based on hired labor, representing an advance in form toward capitalist farming. In handicrafts, merchant capital had developed considerably and had brought artisans under control through forms of the putting out system. But the manufactory as an established form was yet largely outside of the sphere of commodity production. Putting out system means that ये लो पैसा, तुम्हारा skill, तुम्हारा equipment, but बाद में हमको profit produce मिलेगा, etc. In other words, capital was by and large merchant capital, and though the economy was fairly highly monetized, domestic industry still predominated. Any number of reasons may be offered why a society exhibiting such features should or should not have developed into full-blown capitalism in due course. By and large, our inquiry has disclosed that while some factors such as political environment and caste were not as effective in checking commercial expansion as has sometimes been thought, Many elements actively generating capitalistic growth are also not met with. Here it must be, so casteism can't be blamed. Here it must be considered whether the entire commercial structure of the Mughal Indian economy was not largely parasitical, depending upon a system of direct agrarian exploitation by a small ruling class. Holy shit. It is not to be forgotten that practically no rural market existed for urban crafts. Rural monetization was thus almost entirely the result of the need to transfer surplus agricultural produce to the towns, not from town to rural. Accordingly, when a crisis developed within the agrarian system, it was bound to extend to the entire structure of Indian economy. Insofar as capital, confined practically to the sphere of commerce, had failed to develop any independent basis for itself, its fortunes would lie with the Mughal ruling class, and after its collapse, with such other classes as imitated or inherited the methods and institutions of that class, or inherited, right, after its collapse, with such other classes as imitated or inherited the methods and institutions of that class. Denied during the 18th century the large market that it had been provided with by the Mughal Empire, merchant capital had no choice but to atrophy. With this also receded into the background those prominent economic landmarks which in the better days of the Mughal Empire might have been mistaken for capitalistic ventures. तो हाँ, मुगल एम्पायर के टाइम में कुछ बढ़िया हुए थे, but they were not capitalism. This is the end of the paper. This was fun. Let's check some comments and then we'll go offline and come back at 12 for a different live stream. The silver bullion story is most fascinating. Please read this out. Basic theory is that silver in India and China started deterioration, so South American silver allowed Brits to buy mercenaries. Indian rulers had more gold, but silver was more liquid, leading to consistent payment. Okay. Sone ki chidiya. Arabic horses imported cost us. We know that Mughals used revenues to buy lots of horses. Do we know what the empire's fiscal situation was like? Yes, Shastri, we discussed it in the beginning of the live stream. The paper does get into that extensively. Mainly, almost percentage-wise description hai, and mainly for maintenance of army, so that they could maintain a threat of violence. Ye sab bola hai. So, thanks for joining, guys. Coming back at 12. Bye-bye.
श्रवरूढं महाभीमं गुणाद्रष्टाम्बरप्रदम् अस्य युक्तं त्रिनेत्रं च कपालकर्णिकाकरां मुक्तकेशिं ललज्ज्यं पिबन्तीं रुधिरं चतुर्बाहुसमायुक्तं वराभयकरं स्मरेत् चतुर्बाहुसमायुक्तं वराभयकरं स्मरेत्